Hello, everyone. So, I did a video a while back with a background of the BBC's Hollow Crown series, the first season, which covers several of Shakespeare's history plays: Richard II, Henry IV, Part One and Two, and Henry V. And some people may not be aware there's a second season that covers the Wars of the Roses plays. What just happened? There's a second season that covers the Wars of the Roses. That is Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III. Henry VI, the three parts of Henry VI are condensed down into 2 episodes, which, not quite sure how I feel about that. I mean, they did do a good job in cutting out a lot of extraneous subplots that really didn't mean much. But at the same time, they kind of rushed through it. So there are some plot points that really aren't explained as thoroughly as I would like. It's understandable, but just like the first season, you need to have a good historical background because it's very complicated. I have the family tree just zoomed out here. Actually, these are 2 family trees. This one here is a little bit different. We'll move the French tree up here because we'll get to that one. The family tree of the French thrones. We'll get to that. Anyway, so I just want to start just like I started with in the first season. I'm going to start the second season out by just giving kind of the historical background. There's a lot of characters. And as usual, most of them are related to each other. Not all of them. There are some who are fictional and who kind of don't fit on this tree. But you'll get enough of the gist of the story just by understanding the historical background. That's why I love Shakespeare plays, but the history plays in particular, because if you're going to start out, I say this, if you're going to start out with Shakespeare, you want to start with the history plays. Henry IV, Richard II, Henry IV, V, and VI, and Richard III. There's 8 plays in total. People don't realize Richard III is actually, if you want to look at it, it's actually the last play in a long story arc that really began, you could say, as far back as Richard II, but definitely goes back to Henry VI, which kind of serves as, I shouldn't say a prequel because Richard III came out later, but anyway. So let's get started. Now, at this point, this is your one and only spoiler warning. I assume that you've either watched the first season of Hollow Crown or you're familiar with the plays covered. Namely Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and Henry V. I'm going to assume you're basically familiar with those storylines and the characters in them. So, to begin with, I'm going to take you first back to the first season because there are some loose ends that are being tied up, and it's just kind of a recap of what happened in the first season, really quick, because it's important. There are some events from the first season that are going to come into play in the second season. So, basically, as you remember, Richard II was King of England when the first plays opened. He was a grandson of Edward III. Edward III's eldest son was Edward the Black Prince of Wales. He died before his father, so when Edward III died, Richard became king. Richard himself had no children, so he was ousted by his cousin, Bolingbroke, later on Henry IV, and he was killed. And then Bolingbroke took the throne as Henry IV. Bolingbroke played by Rory Kinnear, and then Jeremy Irons took over the role when he became Henry IV. Now, the Lancastrians, and Lancastrians this is going to be a very important term, are the descendants of John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. Remember this guy? He was Patrick Stewart, guy from Richard II. His descendants are the Lancastrians. He had a younger brother, Edmund of Langley, the first Duke of York. He was also in the Richard II play. His descendants are the Yorkists, represented by the White Rose, and the Lancastrians, represented by the Red Rose. Although those those symbols didn't come into use until many, many years later. I think it was like the 19th century before those symbols were actually used. But they're used in the plays and in the episodes. So, here's the problem. Okay, so basically, Henry IV had 4 sons, along with several daughters, but obviously the oldest was Prince Hal, who later became Henry V. Then you had Thomas, Duke of Clarence, John of Lancaster, the Duke of Bedford. You may remember him. He's the one who tricked the rebels into surrendering. In fact, that might be a screenshot from that scene. Historically, Clarence was actually the older. He was the oldest younger brother. He was actually older than than John, but for some reason, the plays and the episodes make John seem like the older one. The youngest is Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the youngest son. Interesting bit of trivia in the first season, he was portrayed by Will Attenborough, who was the grandson of Richard Attenborough. So that's just a little bit of piece of trivia there. He is going to be he was a very minor character in the early plays, but he's going to be a very major player in this season. Obviously, he's played by Hugh Bonneville, obviously a little bit older, although I think they aged him a little bit too much, considering Henry VI takes place only about 2 years later. But anyway, so Henry V takes the throne, and he gets this. In order to kind of quell the rebels at home, he decides to distract them by invading France. He feels that he has a claim to the throne of France, or at least to claim to the throne of France. I'm not going to go into that claim here. It's a bit complicated. Suffice to say, my own personal opinion is, yeah, he kind of had a point, but he really didn't even have a strong claim to the throne of England, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. But the Henry V play ends by the English conquering big parts of France. He makes a treaty with the French king. I said with the French king. What did I do with the French treaty here? There we go. He makes a treaty with the French king where he will marry his daughter, Catherine. You saw the kind of that wooings, that courtship scene at the very end of Henry V. Where he's going to marry Catherine, and Henry will be named Charles's heir, basically dispossessing and disinheriting his son, the Dauphin. This is really the main antagonist of Henry V. I mean, he's the one who sent the box of tennis balls. He was the real rabble rouser. He's disinherited, and the Treaty of Troyes says that when King Charles VI dies, King Henry will be king of England and France, and their descendants, because he's basically married to Charles's daughter, their descendants will be kings of England and France. So great, everything's looking up. England has taken over much of France. Henry returns heroic. He marries the French princess. England owns big parts of France, and everyone lived happily ever after. No. So here's where we kind of get into the new season. So what's happened between Henry V and Henry VI? Like I said, it's only a couple of years apart. But now the good news is, the problem. Well, let's start with obviously, as was explained at the end of Henry V by the chorus, the lines. The chorus reads the ending lines of Henry V. It said, "Small time, but in that small most greatly lived the Star of England. Fortune made his sword by which the world's best garden he achieved," referring to takeover of France. "And of it left his son, imperial lord, Henry VI, in infant bands, crowned king of France and England did this king succeed, whose state so many had the managing, that they lost France and made his England bleed." And that's very prophetic, because the good news is, so Henry dies suddenly of dysentery. He's gone, just completely unexpected. In fact, he dies even before the French king. Which creates an interesting situation, because the heir to the throne now, the French throne, and the English king and the heir to the French throne, is his son, Henry VI. But the problem is, Henry VI, when the play opens, is a 9-month-old baby. And the problem doesn't end there, because Henry VI, was not, to say he wasn't a very good king would be an understatement. In real life, he suffered from bouts of mental illness. He would go into comas. He would be very indecisive. He just basically he was basically incapable of ruling a country. Now, Shakespeare leaves out any reference to the mental illness, but Henry VI is still displayed as a very nice person, but naive, pious, indecisive. He just has no business ruling a kingdom, flat out. And because of this, he is easily manipulated, and that it turns out to be a problem, because things at Henry's death start going from bad to worse. And I always think, when a play ends with a funeral, we call it a tragedy. What do you call it when a play opens with a funeral? Because that's where we are. We're actually placed right where we are in that end of that, because Henry V does the flashback thing. They actually start and end at Henry V's funeral, so we're really picking up right from that. And things are just going to go from bad to worse. I want to go back. There's a reason I mentioned some of the events of the first season. It's not just a recap, but there's something really important happening here. Even though Richard II had no children, Bolingbroke was not the legal next in line to the throne, because the way that English male preference primogeniture worked is that you start with the first son and all his descendants, and the second son and all his descendants, and you go on down the line. When you run out of sons, you go to daughters and that type of thing. So John of Gaunt, he's the Patrick Stewart guy, who was Bolingbroke and Henry IV's father, and of course Henry's grandfather. He was a younger son to Edward the Black Prince. Remember, Edward the Black Prince, 1376. Richard II, the play opens in 1399. So he's long gone. His younger brother, Lionel of Antwerp, is also long gone. He actually died 8 years even earlier. However, Lionel of Antwerp had descendants, and those descendants are the Mortimers. You remember that name? And so the descendants, if you go down this branch, you get to Edmund Mortimer. And this is one of the guys who was in the conspiracy. He was a very small role, in Henry IV Part 1, but if you remember the scene with Glendower, where they all get together to divide up their land, and he's telling off Hotspur for mistreating Glendower and that type of thing. But that's him. He was supposed to be. The claim was that he had the rightful claim to the English throne because he's descended from Edward III's second son, whereas the Lancastrians are from Edward III's third son. That's a very big deal. And so basically, this doesn't happen actually in the play, but the story goes that at least when we get to Henry VI, is that Mortimer's captured and sent to prison, where he dies sometime later. He's played by obviously an older version, played by Michael Gambon from Harry Potter in the season. So. And actually, Mortimer's a conflation, really, of this guy, Roger Mortimer, the 4th Earl of March, and Edmund Mortimer, the 5th Earl of March. Is actually a conflation of those two. This was the guy who was Hotspur's brother-in-law, up here. So, but anyway, so they're kind of conflated into one. So we're just going to assume that this is the guy and they're the same person. So when Henry VI opens, he's on his deathbed. But a lot of the rebellions in Henry IV and Henry V were attempts to overthrow Henry IV and place the Mortimers on the throne. But those rebellions failed, but the rebellion really had just gone to sleep. It never really went away, because Mortimer had an older sister, Anne, and Anne married Richard, the Earl of Cambridge. Now, who is the Earl of Cambridge? Let's go back up here. I'm kind of going back and forth between the two seasons here. The Earl of Cambridge is right here, and here's Anne Mortimer. Earl of Cambridge was the younger brother to this guy, O'Merle. He was O'Merle and Richard II, and eventually he inherited, when his father died, he inherited the Dukedom of York. And so Richard of Coningsburgh was his younger brother, and he was part of something called the Southampton plot, which is a major plot point in Henry V that Hollow Crown just took out completely. And I don't understand that, because it's very important to understanding some of the motivations that happened in Henry VI. But basically, Richard of Coningsburgh, the Earl of Cambridge, he conspired with two other people, basically to kill King Henry V, and this was during the play, and King Henry found out about it, and Richard and his confederates were executed. They were put to death. The rebellion was that's another rebellion that was put down. But he had a son, Richard Plantagenet. He's going to be very important, because now he is a Yorkist because he descends from the Duke of York. But the real intrigue is not his paternal line, but his maternal line. Let's go back over here, because he's got royal blood on both sides of his family here. Okay. So here he is. Now Mortimer had no children either. So basically, what happens early on in Henry VI is Mortimer's dying, and he calls his nephew, Richard, to his deathbed and basically tells him, hey, I was supposed to be the king all the time, and by the way, you're my heir. And this puts some thoughts in Richard's head. Now, earlier attempts to supplant the Lancasters, who they view as usurpers, probably are right, to be honest. Those earlier rebellions had failed when Henry IV and Henry V were on the throne. But now the situation's different. Henry V is dead, and they've got an infant on the throne. So he's thinking, now's my chance. Now's my chance. This is as weak as the House of Lancaster is going to be, and if I'm going to take my right back, this is going to be the way. This is the time. It is no time like now. When things are in kind of a disordered state. Now, why are they in a disordered state? Okay, well, as I mentioned, Henry V dies suddenly. His son is on the throne. He's a baby. Obviously, he can't rule. Because you come to think of it, he never really can rule England. You'll see, he's such a disastrous king. Not a bad person. He's not beheading people right and left or anything like that, but he's just clueless, very naive, a good person, but I think his problem is, he's very devout, very pious, and he kind of feels he can rule the kingdom according to Christian principles, Christian morals, and as he finds out way too late, he can't. He can't trust the people around him. He's easily malleable. He's getting very bad advice from nobles who are supposed to be protecting him. And, he gets manipulated, and to all sorts of, basically things just go from bad to worse very quickly for him. But since he can't rule, fortunately, Henry V was survived by two younger brothers. Thomas, the Duke of Clarence, actually was already dead by then. He died a year earlier than Henry, but there were two younger brothers left. John of Lancaster, you remember, we just mentioned him. He had a minor role in Henry V and Henry VI plays, but Hollow Crown decided to leave him out completely. So basically, according to the show, the only surviving brother of Henry V is the Duke of Gloucester. And so this is him in Henry VI play. So he is the Lord Protector of Henry VI. Well, he's the Lord Protector of England. So he's basically ruling England in Henry's name until Henry becomes of age, since he's basically the most senior person to the throne. at least until Henry has kids. He's basically second in line. So basically what happens, and I don't want to go too far into the story here, but we've got a few problems happening here. I've already mentioned the fact that the crown of England is a little unstable right now because they're having some chaos. The old king, the heroic King Henry dies, and he's got his feckless son on the throne now. Richard Duke of York sees his chance, and he's about to take it because he believes that he has a better claim. He actually has a more senior claim to the throne than Henry VI, and in my opinion, he's probably right. But up to this point, House of Lancaster has been very strong. They've put down previous rebellions, but now he sees a weakness, and he's about to exploit it, or at least try to exploit it. So that's problem number 2, I think. Problem number 1 is Henry's early death. Problem number 2 is, Richard is going to cause some problems and try to take the throne. It gets worse, because, as I explained, that treaty that made Henry's heirs kings of England, well, the Dauphin of France, after his father dies, after Charles dies, by the way, I want to point out, he is Catherine's brother, and Catherine married King Henry V. So he is Henry V's brother-in-law, and he is Henry VI's uncle, maternal uncle through Catherine, Princess Catherine. You remember her from Henry V too. Now, so once his father dies, he's thinking, now wait a second, I didn't sign this treaty. I'll be damned if I'm going to bend the knee to a 9-month-old infant, even if he is my nephew, who I've never met. Anyway, so he's not going to take that lying down. He's going to try to retake France. So you got York trying to retake England for himself. You got the Dauphin basically starts gathering supporters, and no sooner Henry V's body isn't even in the ground yet, and France is already rebelling. They're losing towns. People are getting kidnapped, not kidnapped, but captured and killed. Things are militarily going downhill very fast. It gets worse. So there are other factions developing at court. You may remember Exeter. He was Anton Lesser reprised his role from Henry V into Henry VI plays. Now he was an illegitimate son of John of Gaunt. So he was Henry V refers to him as his uncle, which is kind of true. He's actually a half uncle. He was a half brother of Henry IV, and an illegitimate son. Long story short, John of Gaunt had an affair with Catherine Swynford while he was still married, but when his first wife died, he married Catherine, and so his children were eventually legitimized, but they were barred from any inheritance to the throne. So they can't inherit. They can't be in the line of succession, but they are recognized as legitimate. They're given the surname Beaufort. He has a brother, I'm not sure if he's an older brother or not, but he has a brother, Henry Beaufort, the Cardinal of Winchester. Winchester, yes. So I mentioned that the Lord Protector is Humphrey the Duke of Gloucester. These two, Winchester and Gloucester, cannot stand each other. They can barely stand to be in the same room with each other. They're constantly feuding, and it's not clear in the play where that feud began. I mean, in real life, they had very different issues, different outlooks on how France should be managed, how the war in France should be managed. But that's not really talked about in these plays. But just take it for what it is. They are extreme rivals. So you got all sorts of factions. You got Gloucester versus Winchester. You have the Lancastrians versus the Yorkists. The Yorkists are represented mainly by Richard of York and his cousin, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, played by Stanley Townsend. He's one of my favorite characters in this. Townsend just plays him so well. I just love that character. Anyway, who, by the way, is a grandson, just a little bit of trivia, his last name is Neville. He's a grandson of Ralph Neville, the Earl of Westmoreland from Henry IV and Henry V. So you may remember him. So, in any event. So they're the two people really representing the Yorkist. I mean, Warwick is not a Yorkist by descent, but he's certainly Richard's ally. Now the Lancastrian side, is represented mainly by Edmund Beaufort. Again, another Beaufort here. He is, I guess, you could look at. He's basically Exeter and Winchester's nephew, and so sides with the two of them. So he's the Duke of Somerset. And there's also the Duke of Suffolk. He's not pictured because, A, he doesn't fit on the family tree anywhere, and to be honest, his role in Henry VI has been greatly reduced. Most of his role, for some reason, was given to Somerset. So that's actually convenient for us, because then, we can basically condense into one character. Duke of Somerset, very ambitious, very power-hungry, and basically, Henry is basically being manipulated by everyone around. He's being manipulated by Somerset. He's being manipulated by his wife. I'm going to get to Queen Margaret in a moment. Gloucester is trying to hold things together, but he's almost as naive as Henry is. He kind of has that belief, just trust the justice system, everything will work out fine. Yeah, that doesn't really work out so well. Margaret. Yes, I'm not going to say too much about Margaret because she appears about halfway through the first episode. Margaret of Anjou, who is a relative of the Dauphin, and this is kind of a complex tree there. Rene of Naples, he's the Duke of Anjou. He's taken prisoner. Basically, Somerset arranges a marriage between Margaret and Henry, and let's just say that Margaret of Anjou in real life got the nickname She-Wolf of France, and you will see in this series that nickname is very well earned. Extremely ambitious, not afraid to, I mean, she is after her own power, and she doesn't care who she has to kill to get it. Ostensibly, she's kind of protecting her weak husband, and she is, because she realizes that if Henry falls, she loses everything too. Same for Somerset. So they have to keep Henry on the throne. They have to protect his throne, but at the same time, they're really just using him for their own ends. And that's kind of Henry's story. He's just kind of being passed around almost like a political pawn the entire time. It's not a good. So I mean, when the play opens, and the episode opens at the funeral of Henry V, and you see things going from bad to worse. Just as soon as you can deal with one crisis, two more pop up. The French are in revolt. You got a baby on the throne. You have factions developing at court. You got the Duke of York, who's going to try to press his claim to the English throne now. You got the Dauphin, who's going to press his claim to the French throne. And things are just going to get very messy. And I'm going to leave it there and pique your curiosity a little bit. I mean, you probably know how all this plays out, especially since, did I mention York has 4 sons? One of them is King Edward IV, will be King Edward IV. The youngest son is none other than the future Richard III. But that storyline comes a little later on. We'll see how all this plays out, and yeah, I think that's all I really want to say about this for now. I don't want to give away any. I mean, this is one of those things. It's kind of like the Star Wars prequel. You know how it's going to end in general, but you don't know the fine details. And I think I'm going to leave those for you to find out. Another piece of trivia: York's wife, the Duchess of York, she really doesn't appear in the play. She doesn't appear until the Richard III play. Although a younger actress, is played by Judi Dench, a younger actress plays her in the 6 plays. But she is the daughter of none other than Westmoreland. She's Westmoreland's daughter, and she is the aunt of Warwick by his father, Salisbury, who is a character in the play, but is left out of Hollow Crown. So he's actually a main character in the original part 2, but he's not in the Hollow Crown. So that's it. I hope you found this enlightening. My goal here was to not give too much information, but just to give the general historical background so you know what the heck is going on, because like I said at the beginning, the nice thing about the way the Hollow Crown did these plays is that they left out, they cut about parts 1 and 2 of Henry VI, about 80%, 75 to 80% of the play is cut out. Which is sort of a good thing. There is a lot of fluff in these plays that would kind of distract from the timeline and it could cause confusion. But I think in the process of doing that, I think they cut it too much. And some of the other important plot points are rushed through. And so hopefully this gives you a background. I mean, like, for example, York's claim to the throne is given in an early scene by Mortimer, but he just kind of glances over it. He just says, by the way, I was the rightful king and you're my nephew. Doesn't really talk too much about the actual lineage. So that scene is cut very, very short. The opening scene at the funeral is cut very, very short. There's very little about the wars in France. Oh, the wars in France. One other piece. I mentioned the Dauphin is marshaling people to his side. One of the people who fights on his side is none other than Joan of Arc, who is a character in this play early on, or Joan La Pucelle, I think as she was sometimes referred to. All right, thank you for watching. I hope this was insightful, and hopefully you're looking forward to digesting the 3 episodes of The Hollow Crown, Wars of the Roses. It is better than Game of Thrones. That's why I love these plays so much. I can't tell you how many times I've watched these, and every time you watch them, you learn something. You get a little insight that you didn't before. Oh, I didn't know he was related to that person. It's really fascinating stuff. And especially, you know, it's not like you watch a movie, and there's only one version of most movies. There's something that sometimes there's a remake. But you can watch these plays. You can watch 3, 4, 5 different productions of the plays, and each of them portrays different characters in different ways, and cuts out some scenes and leaves another scene. So you can really watch the same play 4 times and still not watch the same play twice. It really is very interesting. But the nice thing about it is once you understand the historical background, which does take some getting used to, once you understand the historical background, the rest you can fill in by the rest of the all the dialogue, the fancy dialogue, the rest you can fill in by context. It really is not as hard as a lot of people play it out to be. Okay, once again, thanks for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe and all that, and leave any questions in the comments. And again, thanks for watching.